the Zizek. But what I'm really interested in in hearing your response on is how you can have this idea of God as the idea, and yet there still be freedom. Because I think one, if you go on YouTube and you look up these videos of Hegel, you either get the really, really bad one, which has this idea where Hegel has this like this system that where there is no freedom and it's just this devouring system. But then you also have one which I think you would say is also not accurate, where everything is just completely open, perhaps more in the Zizekian sense. But I think you would still say that, well, you do say in your article that freedom is still compatible with this idea of God, and with God who, in some senses, already determined the world to be as it is, and that the world is part of this self-determination of God. So how does freedom fit in with your theism?
So freedom fits in that freedom is also synonymous with God. God is freedom itself. So part of this hinges on the understanding of the concrete universal, in which once you grasp what that is, that it's universal, particular, individual, and that these are three moments which are simultaneous always, and it's just three perspectives that we may flip around with. If God is freedom, let's put it this way, and freedom is the universal, it has to particularize itself, it has to individualize itself. But the relationship here is not a relationship of essence, for example, which is the way that we and the understanding generally think. We think in essences. We think of determinations of this causes that, this conditions that. But the concept does not work that way. The concept, subjectivity, freedom, God cannot work that way. So in determining itself, this is not a causal relationship. It's not something forcing itself on something else. It is simply the self-developing expression of that. So if God is free and God is self-knowing and God's knowledge is being, because God has intellectual intuition, the first step of the free being, which knows itself as free, is to have another free being before it. Because if what is before it is itself not as free as itself, then it could not know its freedom. Its freedom is not its own object. Therefore, the idea that God creates a world and creates it with a purpose, and that purpose is freedom itself, makes complete sense. This is not, it cannot be deterministic. There may be indeed final purposes, and there clearly are, but they're not formal. And that's the neat thing about it. It's not, you can have deterministic relationships which are not formal in any normal way. So that, we have this world in which nature for its own part is free to the extent that it is free. Matter isn't given its laws by God. It's not that, there's matter and then God has to give it the law of gravity. No, gravity is immanent to what matter is. It's just part of its own determination as what it is. God doesn't have to give biological organisms the law of needing to eat or all these things. It's just immanent to what they are. It's the way in which they self-develop. Likewise, we don't have to be given the law of freedom, because we are it. And the way freedom develops freely is necessarily a bit chaotic, because we are born in ignorance. We must, at least in the temporal realm, be born in ignorance. We are forced to make mistakes. There's no way to avoid it. And we have conflicts with each other precisely because we are ignorant, precisely because we have to come to our own mediation, because God cannot come down and just say, hey, here's the right way to live, here's the right things to do. Because as we see, even if we take for granted, that perhaps this happened long ago, in biblical times, clearly people didn't agree. So, God coming down doesn't even help anything ultimately, because we still have to agree to this and know this for ourselves. So there's a long struggle necessarily for all of this. So this totality of freedom requires this necessary contingency. a contingency which has this ultimate end of becoming free, in which this very process of becoming free is itself free. You know, it's in the natural sphere, there are no guarantees as far as we can tell. You know, as far as there being divine interventions, we don't know. You know, we have legends of that, but okay. But supposing that it is the case or is not the case, either way, from our perspective, we can't hold on to this idea that, you know, we're going to hope that God comes down and saves us, you know, before we launch nukes from ourselves. You know, it's all on us to a certain extent. And at the same time, it's just the way that freedom develops. And whatever happens is part of the education process of humanity as a whole. And this does not require some ultimate break, an ultimate openness. You know, this is where I disagree with Zizek, that somehow we have to interpret this as, well, ultimately it's just a contradiction, and the truth we find out is that everything falls apart in the end. Not necessarily, not in the way, finitely sure. But there's a way in which they don't. And for example, Hegel doesn't focus on this world ultimately. There's a reason why the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences does not end with objective spirit, because objective spirit is the objective social state in the world we live in. And Hegel makes it clear that he doesn't think that's where the ultimate resolutions of reality lie. He seems to think that there will always be states, states will come and go, peoples will come and go, cultures will come and go. And that's not where you seek the final unity of everything. And it's not the case that Hegel thinks that there's ever going to be a time in the future, or there ever was a time in the past where we had this ultimate unity. If God is real, and God is definitely the one that is eternal and posits the entirety of space and time and all of us, then God is accessible at all times, and God is actual at all times. There is no point in which God is any more or less.